Okay, so this video is going to be a little bit out of the ordinary. It's going to be very tech related and it's going to be kind of long-winded. So if you're mostly into the videos that I make with running models and with visiting fly meets and stuff like that, I apologize in advance, but if you're into the more technical side of the FPV hobby, this might turn out to be a golden nugget for at least some viewers. So a lot of the videos I made as of late have been featuring the FMS Easy Trainer. It's a very inexpensive and simple airplane, but of course the secret sauce is all the goodies that are installed, which is quite nice FPV gear, including autopilot system, there's a nice camera, there's a long range control system, etc, etc. So I'm gonna make a walkthrough of the airplane. It's not gonna be specific for this airplane. Of course, some solutions are like where I glue stuff in and where I make cutouts and stuff like that, but the general concept is going to be applicable for a lot of models. So I hope this is useful for some of my viewers. Let's dig in. Okay then, here she is in all her glory with the canopy detached, and the reason is that I have two canopies. It's for two different camera solutions, and I put the camera on the canopy itself. And there's good reasons why you might not want to do that on a lot of airplanes, but there is also a specific reason why you might want to do so. So I'll get into that a little later, but this is an overview of the airplane. From the sort of shininess or the sheen off of the wings, you can probably see I put some tape on there. I could have laminated the wings, I guess, but I used packing tape and just put it on really carefully to avoid wrinkles and bubbles. So I suppose starting off at the front with the canopy is a good as place as any. You can see right here I got the video transmitter right here, and I put the antenna as upright as I could, so as to put the radiating element of the antenna as far above the airframe as possible. Logic being that the beam of the antenna, so to speak, or the pattern of the antenna will have to go through the fuselage or wings as little as possible. Now, ideally, I would want to have the antenna underneath the airplane, but this is a belly lander, so that antenna would last exactly one flight. But if you're landing with a landing gear, then that might be something to think about. Maybe you can have the antenna poke out through a hole in the bottom of the fuselage instead. I've had good success with that, at least. So obviously there's canopy missing. So this is the canopy I typically use. And it has a RunCam Split 1 up here all the way up front. And then the electronics for the RunCam Split, they are in here. And I sort of protected the whole thing using a gift card. And here you can see the little standoffs that are used when you put the camera board in the center stack of a multi-rotor. This isn't something I would do on this airplane, of course, but I've sort of embedded the plastic screws into the foam below and glued them in, so they're quite securely in there, and that way I could sort of put the board on those four posts, so to speak, sticking out of the foam. And then on the bottom, I reinforced the canopy with another gift card or such. And that allowed me to, instead of just gluing the camera, I could actually mount it with proper screws. And that feels a lot more secure and safe. And if you see here, you can see that the RunCam Split camera is upside down. And I did it that way so that the ribbon cable would be as protected as possible, as opposed to coming out from the camera up here. And there's an option in the menu to flip the image, so that's no problem at all. The cable for the for feeding the board with 5-volt power and for extracting the camera feed, the live camera feed out, that just goes through a little hole in the foam right here. And then if I dig around inside the sort of canopy area here, this is cam also. It's almost worn off. So this is coming from the flight controller, which is a Eagle Tree Vector, and this obviously carries 5-volt going to the camera to power it, and it returns the signal line with the live feed coming from the camera going into the flight controller, which then has the OSD overlaid, and then it's output to the video transmitter here, so I can actually see the image on the ground. I just connect this right here, and then I fire up the plane, and everything is good to go. And the thing about the Runcam Split, especially the Split 1, is that the solution they've chosen for the memory card is not really a very good one. So it's really impractical to take the SD card in and out of the camera board as you use it. You typically want to connect it with the USB cable to your computer, and that's why I put the camera on the canopy, because that way I can leave the airplane in my car and just unplug these wires right here, and then just bring the canopy with the camera inside to extract the files when I'm done flying for the day. So it's a lot easier for me that way. And then I talked about the two canopies I have. This is another, it's the same canopy. I bought it as a spare part, but this one has a tilt servo on it. So this is the Runcam 1 HD, or just Runcam HD. And it's a decent camera for what it is. It's a few years old, but it works really well for me anyway. And then I have the tilt unit here on the second canopy, and I can just attach the camera up here with this Velcro, and then I use a rubber band to kind of secure it in place. And then the servo lead, which I have here, just runs through this hole back here in the canopy. And this cable that's also here right now, that's to power this camera. It has a battery, but it's nice to have it topped up during flight. So it powers it with 5 volts, and it also sends the live output back on the signal line. So it's just like the other canopy. And I connect it in the same place. This is just a spare ground. I didn't want to cut it off in case I need it for something later. And then this tilt servo runs back here also, and that's connected to a servo cable I have sort of tucked away behind here. I just fish it out with a pair of tweezers if I do need it. And that's just running off a spare channel on my receiver. Now I could run it off of the flight controller directly also, but the wiring on this plane just made more sense to do it the way I did it, coming off of the receiver directly, which is just fine. And then once I have the canopy attached, I use 2 rubber bands and kind of just wrap them around the canopy like this to sort of double secure. I don't trust the attachment clips 100%. Now I guess if you want to be really picky about it, I'm sure they produce a little bit of air drag, but then on the other hand, it's nothing compared to this camera sitting right here. It doesn't matter. And it turns out that often after I make a landing, especially if I kind of come in a little bit too hot or too fast, these rubber bands are like wrapped 4 times around themselves and kind of sitting all the way back here. So that tells me they're actually providing quite a bit of friction and braking force. So I guess it's a bit of a carrier arrest type of system to make me slow down as quickly as I can once I hit the ground, which is always nice. And then this black tape up here, that's just so that the sort of contrast and the color balance of the camera won't be thrown off by reflected sun. And that's especially something to think about when I'm using the tilt unit, because it looks down almost all the way down on the airplane, just barely misses the front of it. You can kind of see there's a bit of a scar here on the front. That's because I had a different camera solution once upon a time where I had the camera embedded here, and I went away from that concept and I sort of just glued in a little block of EPP foam to sort of fill out the blank. And I just want to mention that while I'm at it, there are actually 2 weights in the nose of this airplane. This airplane is meant to be used with a tiny battery if you use what their manufacturer recommends as stock. And it's too tail heavy, so they put 2 weights in here, which are just dead weight, literally. You want to use that weight maybe for more batteries instead. So you can quite easily dig into the foam, even from inside. You don't have to make a hole in the front. You can dig in from the back and sort of fish out those 2 little weights, and I can't remember exactly how much they weigh, but it's enough to make it worthwhile to get rid of them. Okay, so here's kind of a top view into the canopy area. This is just thin plywood that I cut out to give the battery something more solid to rest on. And then I also put some sort of lines of hot glue down here, because it's very high friction. So once the battery is on top of it, the straps don't have to be super tight in order to make the battery stay in position, because the friction of these sort of strips of hot glue that I put down are really doing the trick. And then I just glued in this plywood board using epoxy, and there was nothing complicated to it. And then you can't really see it that well, but I'll try to show you. Yeah, there you go. There's two carbon strips here, one on either side, and that's because when these planes make a nose-in landing, they tend to sort of bend or crack right here or back here. And I sort of wanted to stiffen up the front, especially considering I had a big battery in there. Now, I'm sure you can see there's a wire going through these holes here. That's the wire I used when I had the camera up front that I talked about before. I don't need that wire anymore, but it was one heck of a job to sort of feed it through using tweezers. So I decided once I made all that effort feeding that wire through, I might as well leave it there. It doesn't weigh that many extra grams to weigh down the plane. So maybe in the future, if I want to do something else with it, then at least I have that servo line available for whatever. Now, looking into the inside of the fuselage is really difficult. It's almost impossible to sort of squeeze the camera down in there, but you can see it up front here. This is the attachment for the battery, and it's running into the Vector PSU unit, which is basically a low voltage unit that can output 5 and 12 volts to things like cameras and video transmitters. And then it also has the voltage and the current and all those other sensors that are related to your on-screen display. And then further back is the actual micro vector flight controller. And I don't think you can even see it from here, maybe barely. You can see some of the wires all the way back there. So obviously to get it in there, you need to make a cutout in the bottom of the fuselage. So I'll get to that later, but just for now, I'm just gonna show you that the flight controller is back there, and it's quite accurately on the center of gravity, which is nice. So before I move on to the back of the plane, I figured I'd show a few details on the top view. So I moved the ESC to here. Originally, the ESC is in a slot all the way up front to get cooling from a hole in the fuselage. I closed off all of those holes, so the fuselage is pretty much airtight, I think. If you overpressurize the fuselage of the airplane, it can be negative for the flight controller. The flight controller has several sensors that use barometric pressure, so it's very negative to overpressurize or underpressurize, for that matter, the fuselage. So even if holes in the fuselage might be nice for cooling, for this type of setup, it's better to make the fuselage kind of airtight. For a long time I ran the stock ESC, and one day it just sort of gave out a puff of smoke while I was setting up the airplane, and that was it. And up until then I thought the stock ESC worked out just fine. And I was running it on 3S, which is the voltage I'm using for this airplane. I think the Beck was kind of down-regulating too much voltage, and then over time it was just sitting there getting warm, and it was kind of enclosed here around it, and it just burned up. But this one has been a real trooper so far. I can't exactly tell you what type it is. It's E-Sky, I believe, the brand, and it's about 25 to 30 amps maximum, which works out really well. At full throttle, this airplane is drawing 18 to 19 amps, using the stock prop and the stock motor, which have served me just fine so far, at least. I do have the brake engaged, which means that every time I let off the throttle, the ESC holds the propeller in place. And what that achieves is it stops the windmilling, which tends to happen when you're sort of just coasting through the air or gliding. And that windmilling actually presents a lot of braking force on the airplane. Now, if you want to land in a short amount of space, I guess that would be nice. But for this type of airplane, I'm looking for efficiency, and I wanted to glide as freely as possible through the air. So for me anyway, as long as I can have a folding prop, I don't know if that's available for this size and this attachment, but I don't have a folding prop at least, so for me engaging the braking function of the ESC just makes perfect sense. Okay, so moving further back, this is the GPS puck for the Eagle Tree Vector, or actually it's a micro vector, but it's the same GPS puck. So what I did here was that I kind of sanded down this area to make it sort of a flat recess, and then I glued in a piece of gift card to put something sort of slippery on there, which is easier to glue the puck to, and then it's easier to sort of get it out later if I want to without ripping the foam. And then I just made a hole here with, I think a hot screwdriver is what I used. You can just drill a hole in EPP foam, but I actually like using something hot to make a hole, because that makes the sides of the hole very sturdy, so it doesn't sort of lose pieces as you pull wires through and stuff like that. And then this cutout I made here, that's for the receiver, which is a easy UHF receiver from Immersion RC. And I know the cutout looks small, but I can just barely squeeze it in, and it's sort of like you have to squeeze it in and then close it off, and then you can pull it back with using the antenna, so you can move a little bit here actually. And then I just glue over the sort of little hatch here to make sure that it's as closed off and aerodynamic as possible. I typically don't go in and adjust much on this receiver once it's operational. And then obviously there's a servo lead going off of this towards the microvector flight controller and the wiring harness there, so that runs the SPPM control signal out from port 1 on this receiver. And then also the receiver is fed 5-volt coming from the Eagle Tree microvector harness, which is sitting further up front right here. And then, as I talked about before, I'm using a second port of the receiver, running a servo wire from here all the way up front in the airplane, and that's to power and run the tilt servo on my second canopy, this one right here. And then to get rid of all the linkages running up and down the fuselage, they're just in the way, and the servos certainly are in the way if you have them where they are originally intended to be in the canopy area, and also to transfer weight back on the airplane. So I used the same method of using a hot blade, or I can't remember exactly what I used, but I used some sort of warm tool to sort of make these little cutouts for the servos, and then I just hot glued them in place. One little tip to think about if you're gluing in servos that I like to do is I cover the servos in packing tape first, and then I glue them in, so that way when I want them to sort of release from wherever I glued them, if it's hard to get them out, I can always make some cutouts and sort of peel the servos out of the tape, and that leaves the tape stuck to whatever surface I'm gluing to. But then it's easier to sort of peel off these little flakes of tape than sort of ripping out the whole servo in one go, maybe destroying the foam. And then right here, you can barely see it, there is a carbon strip embedded in the foam over the servo, and the reason is simply that the cutout removed so much mass from the tail. I wanted to stiffen it up a little extra to make sure that the sort of the back portion of the fuselage is as sturdy as it can be. And then apart from that, the linkages are, I think, aftermarket, but they're just wire I had laying around, and then I used the original hardware, I believe, but any servo horn and attachment and linkage will work. One thing to maybe notice is that I put both the linkages on top, so if I'm landing in grass, there's this little chance of possible of the linkages or the servo arms getting stuck on blades or grass or bushes or something, so that's why I have them on top right there. So I'm sure you can see the underside of the wings are kind of shiny too, and that's because I put packing tape on the underside as well to stiffen it up. This is just the original spar right here. Originally the wing is detachable in this airplane, but it's so small I can fit it in my car just fine without taking the wings off, and I didn't want to have one extra point of failure, so to speak, so I just glued in the wings using hot glue either side. And then right here you can see the contours of a cutout. This is sort of the cutout hatch for the flight controller. So there's Velcro inside the fuselage, and there's Velcro on the flight controller. And then the way you have to do it, it will just barely fit in through here. Now you can pretty much rest assured that if you just plop in the flight controller through this hatch right here, it's going to catch onto the Velcro at a weird angle, and then it's going to be one heck of a time sort of getting it adjusted. So one little tip that I like to use there is I put some cardboard over the Velcro on either side, maybe tape it in place a little bit, and then I get everything connected as I want it, and then I slowly kind of pull out the sheet of cardboard, and then gradually as the cardboard is removed, the hooks and loops of the Velcro is going to catch on and make a firm connection exactly where you want whatever you're attaching. So that works well for me anyway. And then once it's installed, I mean, I don't have to get to this thing very often. I can control most parameters using the control sticks. That's how the vector system is set up, which is very nice. And I also have one of those control panels, so I can use the bus out port on the GPS puck, and then I can sort of daisy chain that onto a control panel where I have a little bit of a graphic interface. And then also, if I do have to control it using a computer, I can just make a new hole on the side here somewhere, right here, I think. And then I will get to the USB port that way. And apart from that, the connections are really sturdy the way I made them, so I don't really have much fear that something's going to come undone, so I don't have to get to the flight controller very often. But if I do, then it is a pain in the neck, because it is difficult to get into this fuselage. It's just one of those things about this airplane. And then I put some heavy-duty tape here. It's not gaffer's tape, but it's kind of slippery, but it's much thicker than just packing tape, so I wanted to make kind of sturdy. And as you can see, it's definitely done its job. I land this thing on ice and gravel and grass and all kinds of surfaces. And then if you look back here, you can see that the foam is all chewed up where there's no tape. So you can definitely tell that this tape that I put down on the main part of the fuselage is doing its job. And I guess the fact that the tail end here is chewed up a little bit is a compliment to myself, because I've learned how to sort of flare out just as I'm landing with the goggles. So I guess that's the indication that I'm flaring out correctly, that this foam is kind of beat up a little bit. I also set up this special case that I sort of use along with this airplane, but this case is going to serve me very well with a lot of different planes in the future also. So here it is in all its glory, I suppose. These are the contents that I bring with me when I go to quickly fly with this airplane. Now I have other cases with a bunch of tools, and I do have a ground station, and there's a bunch of things you might use, but the philosophy behind this airplane that I just showed was to kind of have something that I can quickly throw in the car and go fly a decent FPV flight without a whole bunch of extra preparation. So these are the battery pouches, and then I'm using these 3200 milliamp hour 3-cell batteries, and I mean, these are not humongous, but they're gigantic compared to the 2-cell tiny little 1300 pack that came with the airplane. In still air with no updraft or thermals, I'm getting at the very maximum about 26 minutes flight time from this airframe, and I've been up to 35, but I think I had some help from Mother Nature on that flight. And then here, the batteries for both the goggles and the ECUHF system are these Graupner LiPo 800, and they're 3-cell batteries. And I bought a bunch of these together with some other gear at one point, so I have a whole ton of these that are unused. So I figure I want to use those for my goggles. So the way I set that up is a special cable that I made for the goggles. I'll show you quickly. So these are the goggles I'm using at the moment. It has a True D receiver module, and then it has Omni antenna and the patch antenna, which is directional. So for those who are newbies to this, the idea is that there's 2 inputs on this receiver unit, and it's constantly measuring which of these antennas are delivering the most powerful signal. So the logic is that if the airplane is flying behind myself, then for sure this is going to pick up more strongly, because it's receiving equally well in all directions, approximately at least. Whereas this is receiving a lot more clearly, it's more sensitive, but the beam that it's kind of searching with is a lot more narrow than this one, which is omnidirectional. So the logic is that this has to be pointing at the airplane, but it's going to receive signals that are a lot weaker, so that gives you more range or more penetration through shrubs or bushes or whatever you're flying behind. Whereas this doesn't really discern in what direction the plane is at, but it's less sensitive, so it's better for a short range, and it's definitely better if you're out of the sort of beam width of this directional antenna. And here I made this little contraption. So this is just a JST to a barrel jack connector. So this is for connecting the Graupner packs to the goggles. The way this special cable works right here is that I'm tapping 3 cells off of the balance port of the battery. And then I'm measuring all 3 cells using this LiPo checker, and I can read off the voltage here before I fly. And then also there's a buzzer or alarm which will scare the heck out of me if it ever goes off. I've set the limit to 3.3 volts, which is quite conservative. I'm sure I could fly longer than that, but at least it will tell me long ahead of time before cutting out the power. I'm only tapping 2 cells off of the full 3 cells, and that's running into the connector for the faceplate fan, which is here. It can only take 2 cells, so I can't feed the 3 cell directly into the fan. That would destroy it. And I know that if you're really accurate about these things, it's not a good idea to only be tapping 2 out of 3 cells off of a battery, because 2 of the cells will obviously run down quicker. But that's why I have the alarm, because it will go off as soon as any cell is below 3.3 volts. So obviously the 2 cells that are providing power to the fan, those are the first to drop below 3.3 volts, and that will tell me to change out the pack anyway. The only thing to make sure if you make something like this is to make sure you balance charge using the balance connector of your batteries every single time. You don't want to not use balance charging on batteries where the cells are out of balance, which is the definition of the cells having different voltage. I put on the super thick faceplate foam that just fits my face better. And then I have my DVR recorder. Here's the SD card, and I always use that. And the idea, of course, is that if the plane ever goes down, I can have a look at the video, and then the coordinates of the GPS unit in the plane are transmitted to the goggles, and those show up in my OSD feed and also on the recording. Now, of course, if something happens to the flight controller or the GPS or the OSD system or maybe the video transmitter, then obviously I'm not getting any healthy coordinates. I have a backup plan for that, but the reasoning is that if you do make an error of judgment and you kind of just go too far or too low or something, then at least you'll have a clear image at some point before you get the last dropout, making sure you can at least go to that location using maybe Google Earth on your phone or whatever, and that will at least put you in the ballpark of where the airplane is at. So moving on with the contents of the case, here I have the transmitter unit for the EC UHF system, and this crazy looking antenna is a Moxon antenna. It's made by Video Aerial Systems, and it looks kind of overkill, and it's quite big, it's a little heavy, and the way you use it is that the path of transmission is in that direction. So it actually cancels out a lot of radiation that would normally go towards the back and to the top and bottom, and it sort of focuses it forwards. Now that gives you longer range, but this system has such a long range, and the range is so superior to whatever range you get on a 5.8 gigahertz video system anyway. So then you might ask, well, then what is the point of using something like this? Well, first of all, since it's not radiating as much to the top and to the back, you're getting less reflections from whatever objects are around you where you're flying. So let's say you're flying right in front of a steel shed. Maybe it's not a great idea to output as much power into that steel shed as going out to your model, because that radiation is going to hit that steel shed, going to be reflected and come back in the same direction as the original signals coming from your antenna, but they're going to be delayed because they've had a path of travel, then been directed back and have another path of travel, and then they're going to be late as opposed to the signals that are supposed to go to your model. And when those two arrive at your model at the same time, who knows what could happen? You could get cancellations, you could get weird stuff, making sure that your range is actually getting a lot shorter than you should be. So this takes some of that out of the equation. Also, some people can experience that the control signal of a long-range system can actually affect your video feed negatively. Think about it this way. The power coming from this antenna is quite strong, and it's very close to your goggles. And your goggles have a super sensitive antenna that have to read a signal coming from far away, the airplane, right? So you got something listening for a very soft signal, and then you got this thing screaming at it from a very short distance. Now, it's definitely on a different frequency. It's in a completely different frequency range. But you get to a point where a receiver antenna and a receiver circuit might get overloaded from something else sort of beating down on it, even if it's a completely different frequency range. Think of it kind of like you're somewhere trying to listen to someone speaking at you from far away, and they're kind of whispering and you have to really concentrate, and then someone else starts screaming into your ear. Obviously you're only going to hear the person screaming. So that's kind of the logic. And then also I have this sitting underneath my transmitter, and that means I can sort of fly with my transmitter flat or at a slight up angle, which is very comfortable for my position when flying. And that means this will be pointing at the airplane exactly. If you look at people flying around airfields, both with long-range systems, but also with any old 2.4 gigahertz system, a lot of times you can see people have adopted flying positions where the antenna is in a unfavorable direction as to the airplane that they're flying. So that's something to think about for sure. And then I made this cutout here in the case, so I don't have to take the antenna on and off. I just have to attach this quickly to the back of the transmitter. Now, just quickly before I show you the transmitter and the setup for that, I've noticed a lot of times when people are making cases like this where they have their transmitter in it, very often they put it in this direction, kind of like, oh, it's going to be nice to look at once you open the case, right? But I'm thinking, if I ever drop this case, I'm probably going to drop it, you know, from the handle, so it's going to land on the bottom of the case right here. So it only makes sense to have the transmitter this way around. I'm sure the most sturdy part of the transmitter is the seat where it's meant to be put down anyway. So that's just a little thing to think about. And what I did, I used cable ties and some aluminum brackets I had laying around. I can't remember exactly what they are from. And then I attached those to this thing right here, which is one of those universal cell phone holders for cars. So originally there was this sort of like gooseneck type of thing coming out from this holder, and that was a long gooseneck that was supposed to be attached to the windshield of my car with a suction cup. I just removed the whole gooseneck thingy and attached these to aluminum plates with cable ties. And then I can just open this right here, and then I can just sort of attach the ECUHF transmitter module here on the back. And it's just a friction fit, but I've never had any indication that it was about to fall out, so I think it's quite safe. And the way I've done it is that I can place the battery that I'm using to fly with right here, because the ECUHF transmitter module is not drawing power from the battery of the radio. I don't know if it can do that with the Spectrum system, and I don't think it would be a great idea anyways, because this battery is weak enough as it is, so that's nice for just powering the actual Spectrum transmitter. And the way it works is that here I'm using the trainer port to extract a SPPM signal going from the radio into this unit. And the way it's made is that as soon as you plug this in, there's a little switch here in the jack, and that switches off the 2.4 gigahertz module. I don't think it would disturb anything if it was transmitting 2.4 gigahertz, but it's definitely just wasting the battery. So essentially, once you have something attached via the trainer port, this just becomes like a mouse and a keyboard. That's the best comparison I can make. And the actual radio signals are being generated by this unit right here. And then this place right here is perfect for battery. And then I always connect one of these LiPo checkers. I plug it in as soon as I go fly. That way I can sort of check the LiPo, and then I tuck it in here. And this also has a alarm. So if the voltage of this pack was to drop below 3.3 volts for any one cell, this would go off, telling me I need to exchange the battery real quick. So that's the transmitter. And then finally here I want to show this. This is a Trakimo GPS tracker. These are real handy. I bought this on special offer somewhere from a big box store. You can see them pop up from time to time, but you can just go to Trakimo's webpage and buy it. And the way it works is that it will use both GPS and the mobile network to sort of try to figure out where it's at. Let's say you end up below a bunch of brushes or whatever, and it gets wet outside, then it might be hard to get a GPS signal down to this, but then it might use the cell phone signals to sort of triangulate an approximate position. And then as long as there's cell phone coverage where this is at, it can transmit just like a cell phone, and it will send its coordinates to your sort of account, and then you can access that account either using a computer or using a cell phone app, and it's real handy. And I put this in the airplane, of course, so this is my backup solution. So let's say the method of reading off the coordinates from the flight controller in my goggle recording, let's say that wasn't to pan out for some reason, then this is my second source, and this is probably more accurate because this will give me a location of where it's actually at, not where I last had a clear signal from the airplane in the air. So provided this doesn't like get kicked out of the wreckage and sort of falls down a hill and into a river or something, then this will most likely be exactly where the wreckage of the plane is at. So I can get my stuff back and get my recording and make sure I haven't hurt anyone or anything. And the nice thing about this is that I can either place it up front in the canopy area over the battery, or I can push it back towards the CG, sort of in the cavity behind the battery compartment area. And the reason for that is when I'm alternating between the two canopies that I talked about before, they have different weights, so then I can sort of fine-tune the CG balance of the airplane using the weight of this tracker itself. And then apart from that, in this case, I just have spares. I have some spare rubber bands, a spare SD card. This is a LiPo checker, a sort of bigger one. I use this for my flight batteries usually before I fly. A box of adapters, spare cables for the EC-UHF setup. This is a bind plug that I don't need much for this, but it's there anyway. And then down here I have a spare patch antenna and a spare Omni antenna, just in case something happens. If I go fly and have an accident getting out of the car or something and bend an antenna, then it's very nice to have sort of a backup. And then here I have a spare EC-UHF transmitter module. So once I go flying, I'm pretty intent on flying. And then I have a spare antenna. This is just the original Omni whip. I'm not a big fan of those for the EC-UHF system, but like I explained before, but it definitely will work. Then I got spare rubber bands for the canopy. And then I have just a cloth for wiping down the lenses on my goggles or the camera lens. And then over here I have a wind meter, so I can read off wind speed if I want to. I haven't used it even one time so far, but it's a little gimmick, I guess. And then I have a neck strap for my transmitter here in case I want to use that. This gets kind of heavy if you're flying for half an hour, but you do have a nice flying position where I can just sort of rest this almost flat and just balances out perfectly in my hands and still maintains a really nice angle for this antenna. Okay then, so I hope you enjoyed my walkthrough of this FMS EC Trainer long-range airplane. If you do have any questions, drop them below in the comments section beneath the video. Thanks for watching. Bye bye!